Picture this. It's the evening of September 2nd, 1935, and the air tastes like copper. You're standing on a narrow strip of limestone and coral in the Florida Keys, and the barometer has just dropped to 26.35 inches. You don't know it yet, but you're about to witness the lowest atmospheric pressure ever recorded in the Western Hemisphere. This wasn't just a hurricane. This was the storm that redefined what nature could do to the human body, to steel and concrete, to hope itself. The wind didn't howl, it screamed. Let's be precise about what happened. On Labor Day 1935, a Category 5 hurricane, the most intense tropical cyclone ever to make landfall in the United States, struck the Middle Florida Keys with sustained winds of 185 miles per hour and gusts exceeding 200. The storm surge reached between 18 and 20 feet above normal tide levels. 408 people died, though the actual number was likely higher. Bodies were never found. They were scoured from the earth. This was the first Category 5 hurricane to strike the United States since records began. It wouldn't be matched in intensity at landfall until Hurricane Camille in 1969, and then not again until Hurricane Michael in 2018. But those storms had warning systems, satellite imagery, evacuation routes. In 1935, they had a falling barometer and the color of the sky. The eye of the storm was only 8 miles wide, compact, ferocious. The equivalent of a tornado stretched across 40 miles of ocean. Now imagine you're one of the veterans. You didn't ask to be here. After the First World War ended in 1918, after you'd survived the trenches and the gas and watched friends die in mud, you came home to find a country that didn't want to think about the war anymore. By 1935, the Great Depression had gutted whatever life you'd managed to build. So you took the government's offer, $30 a month to work on a highway project in the Florida Keys. Road construction through paradise. Honest work, they said. You're living in work camps, flimsy structures on islands barely above sea level. Islamorada, Windley Key, Upper and Lower Matecumbe Keys. These aren't towns, really. They're limestone outcroppings connected by Henry Flagler's railroad, that impossible feat of engineering that took 4,000 men 7 years to build, completed in 1912. The same railroad that's supposed to evacuate you when the storm comes. You wake up on September 2nd to humid air that won't move. The Gulf of Mexico to your west looks like hammered pewter. The Atlantic to your east has that strange green-gray color it gets before something terrible happens. You're living in a wooden barracks with maybe 100 other men. The roof is tin. The walls are thin. There's no foundation to speak of because you're literally on a rock in the middle of the ocean. The morning drags into afternoon. You're supposed to be working, but nobody's working. Everyone's watching the sky, listening to the radio in the mess hall when there's anything to hear. The news is contradictory. The storm might turn north. The storm might weaken. The storm might miss you entirely. But the veterans who've been here longer, the ones who came down in '34 when the camps first opened, they're not buying it. They've felt the barometric pressure in their bones, that strange ache that comes before major storms. They're the ones quietly packing their few belongings, preparing for something they can't yet name. And you're starting to understand that you might die here. The Weather Bureau in Jacksonville tracked the storm for days, but communication was primitive. Telegrams, radio broadcasts that reached some areas but not others. Storm warnings were issued on September 1st, but the warning said the hurricane would pass to the north. The camp administrators in the Keys didn't panic. They'd seen storms before. They hadn't seen this. By the morning of September 2nd, it was clear the storm had turned. It was coming straight for the Keys. The camp supervisors requested a special evacuation train from the Florida East Coast Railway. The train left Miami at 4:25 p.m. Locomotive, baggage car, and 7 coaches. It had 90 miles to travel to reach the camps. The hurricane was moving faster. You're watching the sky now. It's late afternoon, and the light has gone strange, yellow-green, bruised. The wind is picking up. Not gradually, but in surges that make the barracks shudder. You're gathering your things, which isn't much. A duffel bag, a photograph, maybe a letter you've been meaning to send. The other men are doing the same, but nobody's talking much, because talking requires admitting how scared you are. And you didn't survive the Western Front by showing fear. Someone says the train is coming. You just have to hold on. The train made it to Islamorada at 8:20 p.m. It never stood a chance. The storm surge hit before the evacuation could begin, an 18-foot wall of ocean water traveling at hurricane speed. The wind was already past 150 miles per hour. The engineer later described the locomotive being lifted off the rails and pushed backward. The coaches were torn apart. 11 cars, built of steel and wood, disintegrated. Men who'd survived Belleau Wood and the Meuse Argonne drowned in a railroad car or were impaled by debris traveling at 200 miles per hour. But you're not in the train, you're in the camp, and you're realizing that your barracks is not going to survive this. The tin roof peels off first, one corner, then the whole sheet, gone into the screaming darkness. The walls start to flex. You can feel the building lift. You make a choice: stay inside and be crushed, or go outside and face the wind. You go outside. The wind doesn't just push you, it tries to strip the skin from your face. Sand and salt and coral fragments travel at velocities that turn them into bullets. You can't open your eyes. You can't breathe unless you turn your head. The rain doesn't fall. It travels horizontally, driven by wind that exceeds any hurricane recorded before or since at landfall. You're holding on to whatever you can find: a palm tree bent double, a piece of railing, another man's arm. The storm surge arrives. You don't see it coming because you can't see anything, but suddenly you're underwater, tumbling, your lungs burning, not knowing which way is up. The water is full of debris, pieces of buildings, railroad ties, cars, bodies. You surface, gasp, and are hit by something you never see. Maybe a piece of wood, maybe coral. You go under again. Some men tied themselves to trees and survived. Some found air pockets in destroyed buildings. Some clung to debris and rode out the surge. Many simply vanished, scoured from the earth by water and wind, their bodies carried out to sea or buried in sand and rubble, never to be found. The hurricane made landfall at 8 p.m. on Long Key. The Weather Bureau's station there was destroyed, but before it failed, the barometer recorded that pressure of 26.35 inches, 892.3 millibars. The anemometer, that device that measures wind speed, blew away after recording sustained winds of 150 miles per hour. After the equipment failed, the Weather Bureau agent John Gamage estimated the winds exceeded 200 miles per hour based on the sound and the complete destruction of reinforced concrete structures. The sound. Survivors who lived through it struggled to describe the sound. It wasn't like wind. It was like standing next to a jet engine. A continuous roar so loud you couldn't hear yourself scream. So loud it felt like pressure inside your skull. Some said it sounded like a freight train, but freight trains eventually pass. This didn't pass. It went on and on, a howling mechanical shriek that seemed to come from everywhere at once. From the earth itself. The eye passed directly over Long Key. For 15 minutes, there was an eerie calm. Gamage described stepping out into clear air, seeing stars overhead, while all around him, the island had been swept clean. Trees gone, buildings gone. The ground covered in fish, thousands of fish deposited by the surge, gasping in the sudden stillness. Some survivors, not understanding what the eye meant, thought the storm was over. They came out of their shelters. Then the back wall of the eye hit, and the wind reversed direction with even greater violence. Those who'd emerged were caught in the open. Few of them survived. Across the Middle Keys, entire communities ceased to exist. The town of Isabel was erased, not damaged. Erased. Flagler's Railroad, that engineering marvel that connected the Keys to the mainland, was destroyed in 11 places. 21 miles of track were simply gone. The Coast Guard cutter Carabel capsized and sank. The ferry San Pablo was driven inland and smashed to pieces. Every fishing boat in every harbor was lost. Doctors who arrived the next day described scenes they couldn't believe. Bodies hanging in trees, a car impaled on a palm, trunk 15 feet above the ground. Survivors with injuries unlike anything they'd seen. Lacerations from coral fragments embedded so deeply they couldn't be removed without surgery. Compound fractures from flying debris, signs of massive blunt force trauma. The survivors had sand embedded in their skin so deeply it looked like tattoos. Their eyes were swollen shut from the pressure changes and the sand-blasting wind. The death toll among the veterans was staggering. Of the 684 veterans working in the camps, 259 died, nearly 38%, but the storm didn't discriminate. Local residents died too. Families who'd lived in the Keys for generations were wiped out entirely. Children drowned in their beds when the surge hit. Elderly people were carried away by wind. The postmaster of Islamorada, E.H. Albury, lost his wife and 3 children. He survived by clinging to a tree for 11 hours. The response, when it came, revealed both the best and worst of America. The American Legion, the Red Cross, and the Coast Guard mobilized within hours. But there was no road. The railroad was gone. The only way in was by boat, and the seas were still running high. Rescue workers who arrived on September 3rd found devastation beyond comprehension. There was no power, no clean water, no shelter. Bodies were everywhere, many unidentifiable. The heat and humidity made decomposition immediate. The decision was made to cremate the bodies where they lay. There were too many to transport, too many to identify, and the health risk was too great. Funeral pyres burned for days across the Keys, a grim necessity that haunted the survivors and rescue workers for the rest of their lives. Veterans who survived the storm were evacuated to Miami, where they faced a different kind of devastation. Survivors' guilt, post-traumatic stress, though it wasn't called that in 1935, and a public debate about who was responsible for the disaster. Had the government acted quickly enough? Should the veterans have been sent to the Keys in the first place? Why was the evacuation train sent so late? Ernest Hemingway, who lived in Key West and had drunk with some of these veterans, wrote a furious essay for the New Masses magazine. He called it, "Who Murdered the Vets?" He blamed the government for leaving working-class men exposed to a hurricane when anyone with money had already evacuated. The essay was raw, angry, political, and it struck a nerve. But the veterans who survived didn't march. They didn't protest, they rebuilt, or they moved on. They'd survived the trenches, the depression, and now the worst hurricane in American history. What else could you do but keep going? The storm changed everything. It killed the dream of Flagler's Overseas Railroad. The railroad was never rebuilt. It was simply too expensive, too dangerous, and too vulnerable. In its place, the government built the Overseas Highway, which opened in 1938. That highway, US Route 1, is the same road that now carries tourists down to Key West, though it's been improved and elevated multiple times since then. Every bridge, every causeway, every elevated section exists because of the lesson learned in 1935. The ocean will always win if you give it a chance. The hurricane also changed how America tracks storms. The Weather Bureau, predecessor to the National Weather Service, overhauled its warning system. More observation stations, better communication, clearer evacuation protocols. It wasn't perfect, not yet, but it was better. The hurricane reconnaissance planes that now fly into storms to measure their intensity. That program began partly because of the failures of 1935. A memorial was built on Islamorada in 1937. It's an Art Deco monument, a limestone structure with a curved wall bearing a bas-relief frieze, showing coconut palms bent by wind. Inside a crypt at the base, the cremated remains of more than 300 victims rest together. The inscription reads, "Dedicated to the memory of The civilians and war veterans whose lives were lost in the hurricane of September 2nd, 1935. No names. Many were never identified. Today, if you drive down the overseas highway and stop at that memorial, you can look out at water so clear and blue, it seems impossible that it could kill. Tourists photograph the monument. Divers explore the reefs. Fishing boats work the channels. Life goes on in the Keys, more crowded and developed than ever, with hotels and restaurants and souvenir shops selling T-shirts about surviving hurricane season. But the Keys are still vulnerable. Hurricane Irma in 2017 caused massive damage and proved that despite all our modern warning systems and evacuation plans, a major storm can still devastate these islands. The difference is that now we evacuate. Now we track storms from space. Now we have days, not hours, of warning. The men who died in 1935 didn't have that luxury. They were World War I veterans, doughboys, they were called, sent to build a road during the Depression because the country needed to do something with them. They were promised work and safety and a new start. They got a wall of water and wind that exceeded the power of anything nature had thrown at America before or since at the moment of landfall. Not warmth from the sun, but the fury of wind that could strip steel. Not the promise of honest work, but the reality of being expendable. They didn't complain. They didn't have time. They just tried to survive. Some did. Most didn't. Their memorial stands on Islamorada, surrounded by water, reminding anyone who will stop and read that the ocean is beautiful and patient and absolutely without mercy when it decides to rise. Think about that the next time you see a hurricane warning. Think about the men who faced the Labor Day hurricane with a falling barometer and no way out, and be grateful for satellites and warning systems and the knowledge that comes from disasters like this one. The storm that almost ended those Keys, that killed hundreds and destroyed a railroad and changed how America thinks about hurricanes forever. It's still there in the water, that power. We just learned to respect it. What do you remember about hurricanes? Have you lived through one? Or heard the stories from those who did? Drop a comment and share because these stories matter, and the people who lived them deserve to be remembered.